Okay, thank you for that. So we do have myself, Jenny Stafford Brown. I'll be the lead presenter today, and we also have Penny, who's also going to be here supporting the event today. The session today, just to make sure you're all in the right place, is the BTEC Tech Award in Sport 2022, and we're focusing on preparing for external assessment, with the component 3, which is developing fitness to improve other participants' performance in sport and physical activity. So, as I said, my name's Jenny. I do a lot of work for Pearson in lots of different capacities, including a chief examiner, senior standards verifier, and qualification developer, and led on the development of this particular qualification. I also work in further education and have had around about 25 years plus of teaching experience on BTEC sport and sport and exercise sciences qualifications. I'm very pleased to say I'm joined here with Penny Lewis, who's a subject advisor for BTEC sport and sport and exercise sciences qualifications, as well as the GCSE and A-level PE quals. If you'd like to say a quick hello, Penny.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session.
Thanks, Penny. So Penny's going to be helping me on the chat. There might be some questions coming in where Penny can post some quick responses or maybe give you some links to some support materials, depending on what sort of questions you're asking. And also we'll come on mic as well to help support certain areas of the session today. Now, I realise many of you have probably had a busy day teaching. So the session today it's due to last for 2 hours. We ran it yesterday and it took a little bit less time. So do obviously be prepared. It could last up to the 2 hour period. We will have a comfort break at around about halfway through the session, just to stretch our legs and give our brains a little bit of time off before we come back to finish off the rest of the materials in the session. But there will be questions. I'm sure that you've got some questions you'd like to ask. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the main aims of the session today so you can see what the focus is of the session. And then I'm going to ask if there's anything particular that you kind of came here to try and find out about. So we can try and make sure we answer that question, assuming it's in the remit of the aims of the session that we have planned for you. So we are going to be discussing the external assessment, the component content in particular. We get a lot of questions around that in terms of, is there going to be an exam question on this, or what sort of questions could there be? We can provide a framework for how to interpret the content in the specification and give you some parameters which the examiners would work to in terms of writing questions for the qualification. We're going to have an overview of the assessment and its structure. We've got the sample assessment materials and the additional sample assessment materials that we're using to give the overview for what we expect to see in the live materials. Neither Penny nor I work on the live materials, but obviously we're aware of the processes in place whereby we have these sample assessment materials to offer almost like a blueprint for the structure. And that's what we use to gain this overview that we're going to provide. We are going to spend some time looking at example questions that we've taken from these support materials to help you to understand what sort of mechanisms there are going to be in place for the sample questions. And also we're going to help you to understand how to use the mark schemes. As you know, many of you may well be wanting to use the sample assessment materials as a mock with your learners. So obviously, if you're going to do that, you need to know how to use this mark scheme. Some of you may be examiners and be used to using mark schemes, but the majority of you probably aren't. So I'm going to give you hopefully quite a good overview on how you can utilize the mark schemes to get a good understanding of how many marks a learner would get if they had taken these papers as mocks. We know that obviously this is a new assessment in terms of external assessment that's going live for the first time in January. And obviously the more support materials that you have available to help do that exam technique, do that practice, the better for your learners. So we're going to look and see what's out there in both paid for as well as the freebie sort of like resources that are available for you to access and start to compile and use with your learners. And then we're going to finish on you've probably heard the terminal assessment rules. Some of you may understand that, some of you may not be fully clear. So we're going to go over that in some detail because it's vital you get this right. And we are going to come to that at the end and explain that in a lot of detail. So I'm just going to go over to the chat boxes now to see if there's anything in particular people wanted me to focus on in the session today, or if this is kind of exactly what you're expecting. So I'm just going to have a quick pause for a moment for you to have a think and see if there's anything particular you're really keen to find out about during this session. So please pop something in the chat box. If it all sounds like exactly what you're expecting and you're happy to just focus on these as we intended, then obviously you don't have to write anything. But if you've got something you're keen to find out more about, then please do pop something in the chat box. I can see at the moment there's any technical problems going on, but I can't see anything particular from anybody else in terms of areas of focus.
No, I think everybody's happy, Jenny.
Lovely, great. So you've all signed up to exactly what you expected. So that's really good starting point. So you may well have questions. As I said, feel free to, we do want to respond to the questions, but you're better probably listen to the areas of the content of the presentation, so you know the structure that it's going to be sitting in, and if there's questions around that we haven't covered when we've actually covered that content, then please feel free to put questions in the chat box at that point. I will be referring to the chat box every now and then. I'll be pausing, so if I don't immediately go to it, then obviously don't worry, we are not going to forget or ignore any questions that are coming in. Okay, let's crack on, shall we? So for those of you who've delivered on the BTEC First Award in Sports, that qualification that's been around for quite some time, and many of you may well have transitioned onto this Tech Award, partly due to the performance measures and things that have gone alongside this. You'll be pleased to know if you have taught on the BTEC First Award, if you taught Unit 1, which is externally assessed, then the actual content and the types of questions are incredibly similar to that particular unit in that particular qualification. We did a lot of research and asked practitioners what they liked about the external assessments, what they wanted to see, what their concerns were, and the feedback was overwhelming that the BTEC First Award in Sports content was suitable, and it was something that practitioners were comfortable with, as well as learners being able to understand it. So we've kept with that, as well as obviously referring to the sector and finding out what sorts of things they need in order for progression onto level 3 qualifications. So that's kind of the overview for how we've actually designed the assessment and chosen this particular unit for the external assessment. You then have in the component itself, you'll see the assessment objectives. That's towards the start of the actual unit or component specification. And that's just an overview for what sorts of things the learners are expected to do and how the examiners are going to start to frame their questions around these certain areas. And they increase in level of difficulty, where you start with the demonstrate knowledge of facts, then go on to understanding facts, and then you have application, and lastly, making connections. So it does ramp up in terms of level of difficulty, and that's reflected in the exam questions themselves. So anything that's requiring sort of application of understanding or making connections is given a higher tariff of marks and also targeted at a higher cognitive demand. So that should be quite evident when we start to look at the exam questions themselves. If we go back though to the actual content in the component specification, this will help you to understand what sort of things the examiners do have room for maneuver to do when they're actually devising the questions in the external assessment. And it gives you an idea, again, if you're teaching your delivery and if you are writing your own mock questions, what sorts of things you might want to do to take into account the breadth of content that could be covered in the external assessment. Now, when you have your content, obviously it starts with essential content on the top, and all of that sits underneath you'd plan to deliver in your scheme of work. But to get an understanding of how much you go into, we have what we call the learning aim at the top. We then move into a topic. So under each learning aim, you have a number of topics. So given the learning aim letter that it corresponds with and the number, and some will have up to 5 or 6 topics, some will have less. Under each topic, you'll then have what we call a rider statement. Now, the rider statement gives an overview for how the content underneath it is aimed to be delivered, and also the types of areas of content and where's the ways in which you may deliver it in terms of contexts. So here we have, for this rider statement, learners will understand how each of the components of physical and skill-related fitness are required to perform well in selected sports, and how these are used when playing in different positions in team sports. So that's what they need to know in terms of the content that sits underneath. And here we have the list of components of fitness. Now, this is just a snapshot. There are more components of fitness listed in the spec, but I've just taken a snapshot to illustrate these particular key points. So you've got aerobic endurance, and we've given the information about what that means and how it would be needed in sport. So it's for events or sports lasting more than 30 minutes. So anything that lasts over 30 minutes, where the person is taking part continuously to some extent, there might be some rest periods, but intermittent rest periods, that would be deemed aerobic endurance. And we know there's lots of different variations about what would be deemed to be aerobic endurance in terms of sport. So by putting this in the specification and giving you some clear guidance, it will hopefully help you to then deliver the content around that and show examples of sports or events that would meet the requirements for having high levels of aerobic endurance. So, for example, a game of football that lasts 90 minutes, obviously with half time and occasionally injury breaks, whatever, but that would be deemed to be an aerobic endurance sport because it fits into the information that we've got on that specification there. It's an event or a sport lasting more than 30 minutes. Same with muscular endurance. You've got muscular strength, activities requiring force, and you've got an example of which would be a throwing event. However, there'd be requirement for muscular strength in something like football, depending on the type of position the player is in. So if the player is in a goal, perhaps they might need muscular strength in order to have force to be able to save the ball or to kick the ball hard on a goal kick. So this is where it comes into play in terms of how the different positions in a team sport may use the components of fitness slightly differently compared to their teammates. So that gives you the breadth of the ways in which you're expected to deliver to learners how these components of fitness will be utilized in different ways for different sports, and as well as different positions in different team games. Okay, so the EEG just is one example. There's lots more examples out there, but it's just to give you some sort of context to help you to understand what is meant by that component and how it could be applied. So if we have a look, and we're just going to very quickly look through the content as a reminder, many of you are probably teaching this at the moment. You might be making good progress and making your way through it, or you might just be starting it. But we've got, first of all, the first learning aim is explore the importance of fitness of sports performance. And we've got that first part is looking at the different types of components of fitness, fitness training principles. You've got the additional principles of training and the fit principles. And then you've got exercise intensity and how it can be determined. Now, we've had a lot of questions in this and related to the actual content in a specification. So we've gone to the senior examining team to find out what sort of parameters can be used in order to really clarify some key points related to exercise intensity. So in terms of the training zones, this was a main concern because we have got within the content calculate training zones, but no training zones have been given for aerobic or for anaerobic training. And the training zone is going to be a percentage of the maximum heart rate. And obviously, if you have a look at the internet and you look at textbooks, there's a huge range of acceptable parameters for aerobic training zone and also for the anaerobic training zone. And Penny was getting a lot of questions saying, what's acceptable, what sort of range can we have for these particular training zones? So what's happened is it has been agreed that the anaerobic training zone is going to be any learner who responds with a range between 80 and 90, inclusive of 80-90% of heart rate max, will gain credits. So if they respond and say 81% of the heart rate max is the anaerobic training zone or words to that effect, they would get credit for that. And the knowledge of the aerobic training zone is wider. It's 50 to 80, including those two numbers. So a range between and including those numbers would be acceptable for the aerobic training zone. Okay, so that's the first questions that were coming in terms of what these figures could be. The second part that's been coming in is the expectation is that learners do not have to calculate the training zones to gain credit in the exam questions. They can take a calculator in if they want to in the external assessment, but the main aim of the question is going to be about what a learner would do if they had to try and calculate the anaerobic training zone of a person of a particular age. So if they were able to explain the process but not carry out the calculation, they would be able to gain full credit, assuming they used the right figures. So that was the intention initially. However, if a learner does have a calculator, they are permitted to take them into the exam hall. Then they could do an alternative method of accessing the full marks, would be to carry out the calculation, but they'd have to show the working out to show how they've actually used these particular training zones. So Victoria, so if a learner puts 80% for both anaerobic and aerobic, it would be allowed, yes. So we can see on these terms here, 80 is the lower level of anaerobic and it is the higher level of the aerobic. So it would be acceptable on those particular situations. So yes, I know it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But that has been accepted by the senior team. So all good there. Okay, so hopefully that has you might have been thinking about this when you've been teaching it and not sure. You might not have even really noticed it as being a problem because you thought you were already, you know, quite familiar with the potential anaerobic training zones, but that's just for clarification. We have noticed, and it has been flagged up, that the textbook has got the incorrect training zones in there. And the publishers are addressing this, but in the meantime, if you've got some copies that have training zones that are not within these particular parameters, I'd advise you take a pen and you change that to make sure that learners are reviewing the right training zone percentages. So we know it's very much the application of how they'd go about working out the training zone, given the person's age, how would they work out the heart rate max for that person, and then how would they multiply that with the right percentage of the correct training zone. Okay, moving on to learning aim B, investigate fitness testing to determine fitness levels. This is all quite straightforward and things you're probably quite familiar with. The B one is looking at fitness testing requirements and the admin, so that's looking at the helping support the subject to be ready for the fitness test, the reliability, validity, practicality of the tests, to make sure the choice of test is appropriate. We then have fitness test methods for components of physical fitness, and then the same in B3 for skill-related fitness. Now, there's a long list of tests for each of those different components. Some of those will take a minute. You've got the 1 minute sit-up test, for example. So whilst it may look a lot, it's actually not a lot in terms of carrying it out with your learners. And it's strongly advised that whilst this is a theory-based external assessment, you deliver some of the content in a very practical manner. We know learners who've taken part in activities have got a better chance of recalling that activity, and when they come to sit in the exam hall, they can think back to what they did in the particular fitness test, and they can perhaps recall the protocol or the requirements that might be asked about in the exam. So again, that's a very good thing to do with your learners, to have the practical delivery of them administering and also participating in the test. And then, of course, when they've done the tests, they get to practice interpreting the fitness test results. Students are very keen to find out how well they've done themselves. So if you do the fitness tests with them, give them the normative data, they'll be very keen to work out their own test results, and then they can transfer that skill to the test environment when they will be looking to interpret other people's test results as part of the exam paper. We then look at the fitness training methods. Again, similar to what you've perhaps done in the past, you're looking at fitness training methods for physical and skill-related components of fitness. Again, advice would be to make sure learners experience taking part in those training methods so they know how they feel and they can relate that back to any questions that come up related to those in the external assessment. Additional requirements are really looking at the advantages and disadvantages of the fitness training method, whether there's particular costs involved, whether there's particular specialist training, all that sort of thing is covered in the spec. C5 is looking at provision for taking part in fitness training methods, and this is where we go to the private, public and voluntary, and it's in the fitness training contest. So we've done it in component 1. For those of you delivered on component 1, you'll be familiar with this. And you can see where the synopticity is starting to come in, where you've got some overlap of content that's been delivered and previously internally assessed components. And then lastly, C6 is looking at the long-term effects of training on the body systems. So again, component 1 is looking at the acute effects of taking part in exercise with the effects of the body systems to a warm-up. And then we're exploring that further to look at the adaptations that occur as a result of long-term fitness training. Oops. And then lastly, we look at component D, which is investigate fitness programming to improve fitness and sports performance. And this is all about looking, how would you design a fitness program for a person, looking at the individual data, then applying the principles of training into a fitness program. And then D3 is all about the psychology to help support a person, to motivate them to adhere to the fitness training program. Okie dokie, I'm just having a quick look at the chat. So Gary, there are 26 fitness tests in the Pearson textbook. This is considerably higher than there was for Unit 1 for the BTEC Award in Sport. I wondered the rationale behind this. Do they need to know all of these? Yes, they do need to know all of these. Now, the main difference is within the first award, it was only looking at components of physical fitness. And obviously, in order to get a full understanding of a person's fitness for taking part in particular sports, for example, you need to have the components, the skill-related components of fitness. So those have been added in as well. So there are a lot of fitness tests, but bearing in mind some of them require very little equipment, some of them are very self-explanatory with the name that's given. There shouldn't be too onerous for the learners to cover all those in the lessons. And if you do find it difficult, if it's, you know, in your Tech Award lessons, it might be something that you are using in your core PE, or you might want to incorporate in your core PE if you do find you're a little bit short of time to cover all of those. And then we have, as I was alluding to earlier, we have got, this is called the synoptic unit, or component rather, because it does have the synopticity, whereby we've got content from components 1 and 2 are brought together and applied in the fitness training setting that we've looked at. So we've got the component 1, where we've got taking part in sport and physical activity, and we've got preparing participants to take part in physical activity. And component 2 is looking at components of fitness, and we've got that again in our particular component 3 that's externally assessed. I'm just going to come to the chats to see if there's anything else coming up. So I can see Laura, will these percentages be updated in the spec? They're not actually listed in the spec, and that was causing the confusion. The intention was not to have the percentages in there, because it was never deemed to be a calculated, carry out a calculation within the exam. However, because there was some confusion and there is quite a wide range of acceptable limits, it was deemed appropriate to put some figures onto those particular aerobic and anaerobic thresholds. So we are not planning to update those into the spec, because to do that, we'd have to go through the whole accreditation process again. And obviously, that would take up quite some time, but it's just a case of making sure you're aware of what the parameters are that are acceptable, because we were getting a lot of questions coming in related to that. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. I think I've responded to them all.
Yeah, that's good, Jenny. You've responded to all of them.
Great, thank you, Penny. Okie dokie, so we'll crack on and have a look at the command verbs. Now, in the component specification itself, you will see a list of command verbs or keywords towards the end of that particular content. And what we have here are the keywords or command verbs that are potentially available to the examiners when they are writing this external assessment. So you'll see in the SAMs and the ADSAMs, there are some ones that are used consistently, and they're likely to turn up in the live ones, but bear in mind that the examiner can choose any keywords or command verbs that are listed in the specification. It's therefore important that you and your learners have an idea of the definition in terms of what the learners are meant to do in order to respond effectively to the requirements of that particular question, depending on the particular command verb. So you've got that in place. And we are going to be looking at how those actually operate when we look at some sample questions shortly. Okay, so having a look now at the paper structure itself. So I'm sure most of you have had a little look at the SAMs and the AdSAMs. I will show you on the website where to access those. But just as an overview, the paper is a written exam that's to last 1.5 hours, or they have up to 1.5 hours to complete it, and it's 60 marks in total. It's completed in exam conditions, which is high control. No notes, no books, nothing can be taken in, apart from obviously the use of a pen. They can use a calculator if they want to have a calculator, but it's not stipulated on the front, so it's not a requirement for the exam. The date and time frame will be provided by Pearson. It will be given either an AM or PM time to take it, and the dates will be provided by Pearson. We know the first assessment is taking place in January. It's actually going to be January the 9th. So that date has been set. We've also got this summer date has been set as well. Now, the questions themselves are scenario based. And what that means is you're going to get some sort of context. It's going to be a sporting context, a physical fitness activity, or an outdoor and adventurous activity. So our person or people who are going to be featuring in these particular papers are going to be in one of those sorts of contexts. The questions will then be contextualized to the scenario, and learners need to apply their knowledge and understanding to the context provided. So the first few questions are not always fully related to the context, but then as you get to the higher tariff questions, the learners need to be able to relate their response to how it would affect performance on the whole in that particular chosen type of physical activity, sport, or adventurous activity. There may well be some images in the paper as well. We use those to support learners. If there might be a sport or an activity that might be slightly unfamiliar, then an image is often put in there to help illustrate the key areas of content that are being questioned about. But most of the time, the choice of activities will be those that will be in the national curriculum in PE. So learners should have had experience of them and they should be familiar to them. The paper structure, we've based this on the sample assessment material. That's what SAMS stands for, SAMS sample assessment material, and AdSAMS is the additional sample assessment material. We're quite lucky. We're a sector that has had AdSAMs. Not all sectors get them. Most will just get the one set of sample assessment materials. So we're quite lucky to have another set to help you, to support you with your preparing your learners to use them as mocks. Now, they do have 5 questions in total. The first 4 questions are subdivided into smaller parts. So 1A, 1B, 1C, dotty 1, 1C, dotty 2, for example. And this is just showing the smaller parts. So you have an overarching scenario, and then you have questions related to that scenario that are broken down into different parts. And then the last question is a standalone synoptic question. So the start of the question will always start with a low tariff, often a multiple choice, or definitely it would start with a low tariff, 1 or 2 mark. And that's often to ease the learner into the question, to help get them sort of like get their brain thinking, and to try and ease any of those anxiety levels that might be, and they usually are quite high. We're all like that, aren't we? When we sit an exam, it's always quite a nerve-wracking experience. So they're usually quite accessible at the start of the question. And that's a good thing to make your learners aware of. They're struggling towards the end of the first question, turn over and start a new question, because it's going to be starting with a low tariff and something that hopefully they'll feel comfortable to answer. In terms of looking at the tariff, that's how many marks are available. The highest tariff in the paper is an extended response question, and we have 2 at 6 marks. So there are 2 in there at the moment in the SAMs and the AdSAMs. 1 is at question 3, at the end of question 3, and then we have the question 5, the synoptic one. That's the last question in the paper, and that's a 6 marker as well. And I can see, Richard, you're looking to get a link to the papers. I'm going to show you in a moment actually where to find these. What I'm going to do is going to go through some questions taken from the papers, and then I'll show you where we can access them on the Pearson website. We'll do a little tour of the website after we've gone through this presentation. So I'm going to come back to that, Richard, soon. Oh, and Penny's already done it. Thank you. Okay, sample questions. So you'll be pleased to know that we have got multiple choice questions in there. Most people like a bit of multiple choice, don't they? So here's an example of a multiple choice. Lauren is a female gymnast. Gymnasts require good levels of flexibility. So there you go. We've got the scenario with Lauren being a female gymnast. So that's the overarching scenario. And the questions that come out of that will all be linked to Lauren being a gymnast. So which of the one of the following fitness tests is used to measure flexibility? Choice of A to D, and the learners have to choose the correct response. They will obviously be putting an X in the box for the one they deem to be correct. And then you'll have a mark scheme that corresponds with that. The mark scheme will be often a separate document, or sometimes sits right underneath all the questions, and it's sort of towards the end of the papers, depending on how the sample assessment materials is structured, but you need to know how to use the mark scheme. So I've included snips from the mark scheme with the corresponding question to show how to use it. Now, this is obviously very obvious in terms of how you would mark a multiple choice. We also have multiple choice in a slightly different format where learners are required to link the image with the correct fitness test by drawing a line from one to the other. So again, it's good for learners to have a go at learning the exam technique, to know that's what's expected from them, and have a go at doing that. Obviously, you might want to create some of your own, or we can find and source some others again, so they can just have a go at linking those two particular columns and knowing how to do that. And again, here's the mark scheme to show which ones correspond with which picture. Obviously, make sure learners are familiar with the approach to how to respond to the multiple choice questions, and also what they need to do if they want to change their response. So if they're going back through the paper and wanting to make amendments, make sure they have an understanding of what they can do in order to make those changes. We then move on to the short answer questions, which are often requiring one word, very, very few words on the whole, and that's represented with a number of lines. One mark will carry 2 lines underneath it. And here we have the question is name one type of motivation. And then you have the corresponding mark scheme. So within the mark scheme, where we have anything other than multiple choice, there's often what we call mark scheme rubric, and that's towards the top. And you can see it says award 1 mark for a correctly named motivation. And that gives us instructions to the examiner on what they need to do. Then underneath that, you get exemplar responses in terms of what is acceptable. And it might allow other options. If there's anything else, it will put that underneath. Here, we only have 2 correct responses: intrinsic motivation or extrinsic motivation. You'll see the wording in brackets. That is not necessary for learners to write. If they just write intrinsic, they can get that full 1 mark point. So bracketed information is usually there, so the context makes sense, but doesn't necessarily have to be there to gain the full credit. We also have completing a table as a mechanism for the questions that could be presented in the actual live paper. Here we can see Luca, you've got the context of Luca earlier on, but he can't decide whether to join a private provision or a public provision fitness club to increase his tennis fitness. Obviously, Luca is a tennis player. The learner has to complete a table by stating one advantage of private provision and the benefit to this for the performer, and one advantage of public provision and the benefit of this to the performer. So that does look initially like quite a lot to do. It's actually quite straightforward, but if you're a learner seeing this for the first time, it might look quite confusing. So it's a very good idea for learners to have a few goes at this type of question, so they don't get phased when they're presented with this, and they know what to do, and they know how to fill in the table appropriately. So the top row is all to do with private provision, and the bottom row is all to do with public provision. So just some things again to support learners with exam technique: how to access and how to take on board the content from the question, and then where they need to respond and where the responses should go. And then you've got the mark scheme that goes with this. Now, within this mark scheme, you can see there's quite a few different potentially correct responses. So in this mark scheme, you've got 1, 2, 3 potentially correct ones and the advantage of the type of provision. You'll also see underneath the table, accept any other appropriate response. And what that means is there's more credit-worthy responses available. They just haven't all been captured on the mark scheme. And you'll see as you go to higher tariff questions, you'll usually get that a lot because there's lots of a wide range of responses that can gain credit, but it would take up too much space to put it all on the mark scheme. So it just gives an overview for the types of rewardable answers. You then got the interpreting results. We talked about this earlier in terms of the content in the specification. Here's an example of what a learner might see and also showing what sort of things learners need to know about. So Samantha's coach carries out the ruler drop test. Samantha scored 16.5 centimetres. Using the normative data table in table 3, state how she performed. So you can see here, the expectation is that learners don't have to remember normative data, which is a good thing, because I don't think I could remember that sort of data at all. And we therefore absolutely do not expect learners to, because we will all refer to normative data tables. So learners will be presented with the normative data, and they'll be given a score from a person taking part in a designated test, and they just need to determine what that rating actually means. And in this particular occasion, Samantha has got average because she falls in the 16 to 20.4 centimetres score category, and therefore giving the rating as average. You then have the longer text responses, and you can see there's a few more lines here, and as you'd expect, some more marks available. So this is up to 2 marks a learner can receive if they get the answer right. So Luca takes part in some fitness tests to assess his fitness for tennis. Explain one reason why Luca would use a 30-meter sprint test to assess his fitness for tennis. So we've now got the command verb explain. And if we have a look at the bottom right, you can see I've just cut and pasted the command verb and the definition that was taken from the unit, the component itself. So explain means present an explanation that requires a justification, exemplification of the identified reason, way, benefit, or importance. So we need to justify the reason that Luca is using the 30-meter sprint test to assess his fitness for tennis. And here you can see the mark scheme, 1 mark for a correct reason and 1 mark for justification for that reason. And then you've got an example response, test his speed. That's the first marking point. So it's just confirming the component of fitness that it's measuring. And then after that, they're linking it directly to tennis. So you can see how knowledge of the sport is necessary, because the second part is all linked back to how it's going to benefit his tennis performance. And that's being quick to get to the ball before it bounces out of court or before it bounces twice, or anything around that can gain credit. It's also important for you, if you are marking this for your learners as a mark, that you can accept the response in the opposite order. So they could talk about he needs to be quick to get the ball before it bounces, and this test measures his speed. So that would get the full 2 marks. It's just set in the other way around. So that's absolutely fine in reverse order on this occasion. We've then got again another 2 marker just to have a little look at. As a gymnast, Lauren will warm up at the start of every training session. Explain one component of a warm-up. Now, obviously in this, learners who are familiar with the warm-up will know there's actually 4 different components in a warm-up. So they need to just have to make sure they're choosing the one they're most familiar with in order to give that justification or that further information about what is happening in that particular part of the warm-up. And here you can see in the mark scheme ways that learners could access those 2 marking points depending on which component they select in their response. And again, you've got accept any other appropriate answer. The second part is going to be the bit where there's room for variation. The first 4 aren't going to change because they're different components of the warm-up, and there's no more than that. And we've also got another one here, which is now moving up to 4 marks. Now, 4 mark questions, I haven't got all of the lines on here, but there'll be 8 lines in the response for learners to write in. So that will automatically tell the learner they need to write a bit more because it's got 4 marks. Samantha's coach sets her 2 goals. These goals are to help her to improve her turns and develop her speed leading up to a turn. By the way, Samantha is a swimmer. Explain 2 different types of goal. So within this, it's explaining 2 different types of goals. So it's the same principles as the previous questions. So there were 2 marks, but it's looking at one area in greater depth. So they need to look at 2 types of goal and then give justification or reason as to what the purpose of that particular goal is in order to get the second marking point associated with each goal. So again, it might be that learners can just remember the 2 types of goal. So if they were to write short-term goal and long-term goal, they'll get 2 marks in total. So they don't necessarily have to give the explanation if they get stuck. As long as they can identify 2 different types of goal, they're going to be getting some credit for their response. So again, other tips to help you with exam technique for your learners. I'm just having a quick look at the time and a quick look at the chats before we have a look at the extended response questions. Is there anything that we've talked about there that people would like further clarification on? Any questions? Okay, I can't see anything coming in, so assuming that's good. I think we'll carry on with the extended response levels. That's
sorry,
right,
yeah, there's no questions coming in. Sorry.
That's all right. Thanks, Penny. So we'll have a look at extended response levels based marking. This is quite a big one. So it does take a little while to get your head around, but these are the 6 mark questions that do cause concerns for learners. And obviously, if you're hoping to mark these questions and you've not done marking on this sort of thing before, there's a few things you need to bear in mind in order to understand how to apply the mark scheme. Now, it's worth noting that our examining team, they have a day to standardise on how to use it and mark. They don't spend the whole day on extended responses, but a large portion will be on this to make sure they're understanding and applying the mark scheme correctly. So it is quite a difficult concept on the whole, but if you can understand the basics, you can start to make an attempt to use it and try and make sure you're allocating marks appropriately to learners when they are using these papers for mocks. Now, within a levels-based mark scheme, you have 2 key bits of information. You have what's called indicative content. And what this is, it's content that reflects the key areas of the question that's targeting, but it's not an exhausted list and it's not a model answer either. So I'll just give you some key points of content. There may be further content that's not there that would be able to gain credit. It's just an overview as to what sort of things and how learners could respond. You then have next to that, you have levels-based descriptors. And each level is made up of a number of traits. And the traits we'll see in a moment are bulleted, so you can see what a trait is. Now, these are combined together to articulate the quality of response that a learner needs to demonstrate in order to get points within a particular level. Within the traits themselves, it's a best fit approach. So learners may not cover all areas of the traits within a level, but if they fit it best, that's where they can get the credit from. And if we have a look at an example of a levels-based mark scheme, here on the left, you have the indicative content. The first 2 paragraphs are kind of the overview to give the instructions. And then underneath that, you have the actual indicative content that's specific to a particular question. And then on the right-hand side, you have the levels-based descriptors. So on the left-hand side, you have a level. So you've got level 1, 2, and 3. In the column next to that, you have the marks that are available. So level 1 response can gain between 1 and 2 marks, whereas a level 3 response can gain between 5 and 6 marks. So what you do is you look at the learner response and you first of all determine what level it's in. And to do that, you look at the traits which are given in the descriptor column on the far right-hand side. If we look at level 3 and look at the traits there, they're all bulleted. The first bullet is demonstrates mostly accurate and thorough detailed knowledge and understanding. Most of the points made will be relevant to the context in the question, and there will be clear links. And then lastly, displays a well-developed and logical assessment which clearly considers the factors or events and their relative importance, leading to supported judgments. So if a learner has demonstrated those in their response, they are going to be deemed at level 3, and how well they hit those descriptors will determine whether they get the top marks of 6 or whether they get the lower mark of 5. So if it demonstrates mostly accurate and thorough detailed knowledge, it might be they've done nearly everything right but missed something out, then they're going to get the 5 marks. If they cover that completely, they're going to get the 6 marks, for example. So that's just like an overview on how you can interpret the descriptors and how you can use them in order to start to work out what level the learner response is in. We then have a question on the left, which is actually related to the mark scheme we've just looked at, but let's have a look at the question and then it'll make more sense on how we apply this extended response mark scheme. Samantha is a 100-meter breaststroke swimmer. Samantha's coach sets her 2 goals. These goals are to help her improve her turns and develop her speed leading up to a turn. Samantha's coach uses the acronym SMARTER to set 2 personal goals. Assess how Samantha's coach could use specific, measurable, and recorded goals to improve her performance. So that's the question. It's 6 marks, and it's quite clear there are 3 areas, specific, measurable, and recorded, that the learner has to talk about. If we have a look here, the indicative content makes much more sense. So the learner has talked about specific, and it gives you some content that could be credit-worthy. So specific, the individual to the performer state exactly what is wanted to be achieved. For example, to increase the amount of speed over 100 meters would be deemed to be specific. They've taken that information from the context that's been provided. And again, the measurable and recorded have a similar approach whereby initially it's telling you what that particular goal is, and then how it relates directly to Samantha. And then you've got the last question in the paper, which is the other 6 marker extended response. And this is what we call the synoptic question. And this means it can bring in content from other areas outside of this component. So they might cover content that has been covered in component 1 and 2. So it does offer that option for learners to bring in previous learning and put it in the context that's provided here. So the question is, technology is often used in fitness testing. Now, we know technology came in component 1 when you're looking at getting ready to take part in sports. So that might be something they've learned about, and it's also covered in this component as well. So there's 2 areas it's covered in, but they can bring in prior knowledge if they wanted to. So evaluate the use of technology when carrying out the 30-meter sprint test. Now, again, I've copied and pasted the definition of the key command verb on the right-hand side, and this is evaluate. Now, evaluate, I'm going to read out the definition. Consider various aspects of a subject's qualities in relation to its context, such as strengths and weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons. Comes to judgment supported by evidence, which will often be in the form of a conclusion. And that's a key thing with the command verb evaluate, whereby a conclusion needs to be offered at the end of the response. And we can see this in the descriptors on the left-hand side. And that's shown on the last trait where we look at, I'm going to go to the level 3 descriptor. The last trait on the last bullet says displays a well-developed and logical evaluation, which clearly considers different aspects and competing points in detail, leading to a conclusion that is fully supported. So in order for a learner to get top marks, they have to have provided some form of conclusion in their response. So again, another good exam technique would be to encourage learners, as soon as they see an evaluate in the question, to finish their response with words such as, so in conclusion, or to conclude, or something around that will remind the learner they need to give some form of conclusion. It also helps the examiner to see that some form of conclusion has been provided, because sometimes conclusions are not totally evident with the way they're worded by some learners. So that just helps on both accounts to make sure learners do include some form of conclusion. And then you can see in here, it's all about the pros and cons. So again, if learners know an evaluation is about the pros and cons, you can see how the indicative content relates to content that could be acceptable to gain credit related to specifically using technology to carry out the 30-meter sprint test. Okay, are there any questions coming in?
No questions at the moment, Jenny.
No questions coming in. Rightio. I think we're going to pause for a moment there. So if we take a comfort break, so if we have a 10-minute comfort break, we can then have an explore of the Pearson website to have a look at resources to support with external assessment. And then we're going to go on to the availability and the terminal assessment rule and support. So I think that's what we'll do next. So if we take a break now for 10 minutes, I think that's nicely timed for us to recompose, have a chance to refill our tea or coffee cups, and then come back at 5 to finish off the session. Okay, thank you, everybody. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat if you need to, but we'll have a break for 10 minutes now. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See you at 5.
2 sales down and get this third one on now. This is probably the biggest sale on the ship, so it's going to look quite the part of it on. See why it'd be a labour of love working on something like this in your shed on the weekends, or hop in and do a bit more.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you've managed to get a quick cup of tea or coffee in as we head towards the end of the session. So a few more things to go through. And I see there's been a couple of questions coming in related to where to find materials. So Gareth, thank you very much for that. It was perfect timing. So I'm going to show you where you can find on the Pearson website all the content that we've been looking at, and also some support materials. So if you go to the first page, the Tech Award, it would look like this. So this is where you got the specification, and there's Penny. Hi, Penny. And if you have a cross to the right-hand side where it says course materials, click on that, and they'll bring you, again, you can still access the specification, but you can see also you've got a button here that says specification and sample assessment materials. So you want to go to the sample assessment materials and you click on here. Now this section has got sample assessment materials for all components, so you need to find the ones that relate to component 3. So let's start with the sample assessment materials. They are here, so they're the bottom part of this. So if you click on that, it will open the question paper and mark scheme for the sample assessment materials. If you'd like to have a look at the additional sample materials, you can find the additional sample material component 3 mark scheme at the top. Then just to make it a little bit more tricky, the question paper is below that, called the additional sample assessment material component 3. Okay, so whilst those 2 documents, the question paper and mark scheme, are not together for the additional sample assessment materials, they are together in one document for just the first set of materials called the sample assessment materials. That's a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? But hopefully you now know where they are and how you can access them to download and use with your learners. You can also see, if you are interested in having a look at published resources, if you click the next tab along to published resources, it will bring you to the page of Pearson endorsed or Pearson written resources. Now we have got a few here that are specific to component 3, so we'll have a little look at those so you can see for yourself whether you like the look of them or not. So first of all, we've got the BTEC Tech Award Sport Practice Assessment Plus, and what this is a booklet of sample questions that are written in the same manner as the ones from the sample assessment materials. If you want to have a look at them, you just click on Try Samples, and then you choose the section you want to look at. We want to look at the Practice Assessment Plus, so I'll download the PDF and I can have a little look to see if it takes my fancy and if it's something that I'd like to invest in. So you can have a look here. You've got the multiple choice options here. We've got interpreting information. You've got completing a table. You've got 1 mark questions, 2 marks. Again, you've got a range of tariffs available. I'm just having a quick look to see if we've got a 6 marker in the mix on the sample. There's quite a few here. Yes, you've got a nice 6 marker too. So you've got the whole range there in terms of numbers of tariffs, and then you've got different mechanisms of response there. They are quite reasonably priced. I don't get any commission for saying any of this, but they are something that perhaps you might want to look at. Or learners might want to request one perhaps for a nice little Christmas present to have in their stocking. There's also a revision guide, and it looks like this. We'll have a little look at it. We want to go to revision guide, so I'll click here, down at the PDF, so I can have a little squiz, see if it's something that takes my fancy. And then if you have a look through, you can see how they're set out. So quite nicely set out in terms of different areas of content focused on, with key information, a little bit of sticky tabs on there to highlight key things that are shown here in a training program. And at the end of each page, you've also got a reminder in terms of sort of active revision, where it's asking questions related to the content that's been covered in that revision page. So again, something else that you might want to invest in, to have at your centre, or encourage your learners to consider buying for themselves. I know that's something that many centres like to do, especially when they are, as I said, quite reasonably priced when you look at them. You've also got a freebie. Let's look at the freebie. So this is called Exam Wizard. If you were just pop in the box, if you're on here, you just put in the box here, Exam Wizard. Should we do that? And so you can sort of like explore with me how you'd find it. It'll be the top one that comes up. So let's click on that, and there I am. So Exam Wizard, I want to log into Exam Wizard, so I click on that. And then I want to choose a BTEC. So I'm on the right hand side because that's my BTEC box. And then I'm going to scroll down because I want to look at sports. So I click on sport, proceed to log in. I then have my Excel online. That's already been logged in from previous work I've been doing. So you'd have your login details to log in. I'm then going to build a paper. So in my paper, I'm going to find questions that relate to the qualification we're looking at. So I've already put sport in at the start. So now I know if I click on Level 1-2 Tech Award 2022, it's always going to be sport related. Now I've just been delivering, let's imagine I've just been delivering information on training methods. So I'm going to put training as my search word. So click on that, and then I can see a range of questions that are available for me to pop in a paper that I can give to my students as a quick check revision to make sure they've understood everything I've been talking about when I've been teaching them about training. So I can see there's a 2-mark here. I'm going to have that. I like the look of that. Another 2-marker on maximum heart rates. I'm going to have I want to see if I can find any higher tariff questions. So I'm just scrolling down. There's a 4-marker there. And then I'm going to see if there's any more. There were some 6-markers in here, but I couldn't find them now. So I've added all the ones I want. I'm now going to have a look at my paper that I've put together. I've put 4 questions in. I'm going to have a look at them. And what it's done is put the questions in order that I've popped them in on the left-hand side. It's brought them all together to sit in one exam paper. Okay. And also, magically, it's put together the mark scheme that corresponds with each of those specific questions that I've chosen. How lovely is that? And then if I think, actually, I'd rather have a 2-mark question at the end. So I'm going to move that, well, I'm going to move it down a bit. I'm going to start with a 1-marker because that's usually what happens in the exam paper. So I can maneuver the questions around once I've chosen the ones I want to fit into a format that represents something like an exam paper may look like. And there we go. I've got my exam paper, my mock paper that I'm going to use with my students after the work I've done with them, and I've got my mark scheme that goes with that, so I can mark that piece of learner's work and give them an idea of how well they've done. So again, that's a free bit of software that's well worth a look. If you've not discovered it already, it's got a huge bank of questions because we've taken questions from the BTEC First Award where there's corresponding content to this particular qualification, and also where the questions are written in a similar manner. So you'll find a huge bank of questions that are available that go beyond the SAMs and the AdSAMs that we've just shown you where they are on the Pearson website. Any questions on that before we go back to the presentation?
All good.
All good, right? We're all very quiet out there today, aren't we? Okay, that's probably a good sign. Hopefully that means you're all taking it all in. It's all making perfect sense. So we'll finish now in terms of the availability and resits and the terminal assessment rule, because there's some key bits of information that are really important. And we're conscious you're all going through this for the first time and we're still learning. And it's a chance to make sure that we are doing things in the right way. So we've got the availability. We know that there are 2 sittings a year for the external assessment, one in January, February, the winter series, and one May, June, which we call the summer series. And we've got the first date already, and I can see Penny's been putting the summer date in there as well. You need to make sure you enter learners for the series in which you want them to sit the assessment. It sounds quite straightforward, but just make sure you are making sure you're entering them for the right series, given that there are 2 per year. And learners can have 1 resit of an external assessment, but the key thing is it's got to be related to the terminal assessment rule. And I'm going to hand over to Penny at this point because Penny's really good at talking around this particular requirement, which is specific to the Tech Award, and any awarding organisation that's got the Tech Award has to follow this. It's the Department for Education rule, this terminal assessment rule, and it's the first time we've had it in a BTEC qualification. So it's really important you understand what this means and the implications for when you set your learners for the external assessment. So I'm going to be quiet and hand over to Penny to explain this in more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So I just want to make sure that everybody fully understands what the terminal assessment, the terminal rule means. And what it does mean is that a learner must take the external assessment, so the component 3, in the final series, i.e. the one in which they're going to certificate. Now, I know some centres, okay, not many, but there may be some people on here who are who have entered learners for the January series. Okay, so for this January, some learners will be sitting the exam. The first thing to make sure is that if any learner is sitting the January exam, that they have completed component 1 and component 2, either in a previous series or in this December-January window, to meet the requirements of the terminal rule. And if you are getting learners to sit the external assessment component 3 in this window, and I know some centres are, and then you might think, oh, actually my learner didn't do very well in component 1 or component 2, I want them to resit it in the summer. Now, this is where it's really important that they can resit it in the summer, component 1 or component 2, but they must also resit component 3 in the summer, because that's when they're going to certificate, and the rule of terminal assessment is component 3 must be sat in the final series when the learners certificate. So just, do we have any, can you just put in the chat, do we have any centres that are entering candidates in January for component 3, just to get an idea, just so that I can see? If you just put yes, okay, or just acknowledge it, if any centre has got learners. So Sarah, okay, Gary, okay, so there are a few people. Yeah, that's fine. So I just want to make sure that for everybody who has said yes, for everyone who has entered learners for the January for component 3, that they have taken component 1 and 2 either in the previous series or in this December series, that they are submitting work by the 15th of December. So when they sit the exam, they will have, in this series, they will have completed the course. So I just want to make sure that everybody has done that. And then if you are thinking of any learner who wants to resit, now if they want to resit component 1 and 2, they will also must resit component 3 to meet that terminal rule. If you want your learners just to sit component 3, that's fine. So they've sat it in January and you want them to resit it in the summer. Please remember, for the external assessment for component 3, it is a result that they will get in the summer, not the best result. It's a result they will get in the summer. So if you have a learner that gets a level 2 merit and say gets 36 points in January, and then they resit it in the summer and they only get a level 2 pass, okay, it will be the level 2 pass that will contribute towards their overall qualification. So please, please, please be really careful with your learners and make sure that you are fulfilling the requirement of the terminal assessment. So Kevin has asked, can they resit 1, 2 and 3 in the summer? Yes, learners can resit all 3 of them, okay, but if they resit 1 and or 2, they must resit component 3, because component 3 is the requirement for the terminal rule, and component 3 must be completed when the learner certificates. So yes, Kevin, they can, but if they could resit 1 and 2, they must resit component 3. That's great. Okay, so I hope that is very clear to everyone, particularly the centres that have entered for this January. I hope that's quite clear. If you've got any queries, or you're not sure, or you think you might be doing something wrong, then please, I will put the link to where you can arrange a meeting with me. Thanks, Jenny.
Lovely, thanks for that, Penny. So it's a bit of a funny old thing to get your head around, and it does obviously have big implications in terms of when your learners sit the external assessment. So whilst they can do a resit of the internally assessed components, if they've already sat the externally set component, they'd have to redo that as well as resitting an internally set component. So it's, as I said, it is quite complicated, and so it's really important to get the timing right. And sometimes, you know, you might want to consider, do you really want to offer a resit? Is it better giving learners the full duration of teaching and just give them one opportunity to sit the external assessment, but give them the best chance of doing well in that particular external assessment, because they'll have had more time for teaching and for preparation for the external assessment. So yeah, so something to consider. And there's an overview in terms of what it means and certification. So essentially, it's really important to get those timings right. So in terms of support, we've had a look already at the SAMs. We know there's AdSAMs available for this particular sector, which we're very pleased to have. We've looked at Exam Wizard, and I've shown you, hopefully you may have used it in the past. If you haven't, hopefully now you've got a good idea of what can be done and how useful this particular piece of free software is for you to access and support with your assessment for your learners. We also have a Results Plus. This is available once the exam has been sat and once the results are out, and it gives you an overview for how well learners have performed. So it gives you an overview, sort of a national level, at a cohort level, you can see how well the whole class has done. It might inform your delivery. There might be some areas of content that your whole class have not performed particularly well in, and it might give you an opportunity to review how you've taught that and consider different teaching methodologies that might have been perhaps a little bit more complex than had been initially assumed, and therefore teaching might want to be updated in line with that. You've also got the ability to drill down to individual learners. So if they are going to be offered a resit, you can see the key areas of content you need to focus on when you're carrying out that remedial action to support that getting ready for a resit. And then of course we've got the paid for resources that we did have a little look at. Then Penny was obviously offering support there. You've got access to book appointments with a Penny. I think that link you've put in there is related to that. Is that right, Penny, or have you popping the link in? Great, yes. Thank you. So anybody who's heard anything in there that you'd like some further clarification on, specifically for the terminal assessment rule, make an appointment with Penny to get that clarification and support you may need to make sure you're getting the timings right. Indeed, you can obviously get in touch with Penny about other factors related to the BTEC qualifications, but that's obviously something related to what we've just been discussing now. So yeah, just really to summarize now, the aims of the session were, as we know, discuss the external assessment component content, gain an overview of the assessment and its structure, look at example questions and the accompanying mark schemes. We have gone into some detail about how you can apply the mark schemes. So if you're not an examiner, many of you probably aren't, but it gives you an understanding of what an examiner would be doing. So you can attempt to mark any materials yourselves and get a good idea of how learners would perform in a mock test. You would look at the support materials available, both paid for and the freebies. And also at the end, we looked at the terminal assessment rule to make sure that you all got a good understanding of what that means in the implications for sitting at different times of the year. Okay, I believe we're going to have a poll coming up in a moment. So Ellie, if you wouldn't mind popping the poll on there for participants, if you wouldn't mind filling it in, it's like 3 mini questions just to get an idea of how you found the session. But in the meantime, we do have now time for Q&A. So if you'd like to ask us any questions that we haven't perhaps answered as fully as you'd like, if there's something else you'd like to get some answers to, we've got a bit of time now to help out. So yeah, over to yourselves. If you'd like to pop something into the chat, Penny and I would be very happy to help.
Yeah, Jenny, I think David has just asked, can I confirm about the question of resits? Okay, so if your learners have completed component 1, 2 and 3 in this January, then they can resit component 1 and or component 2 in the summer, but they must sit component 3, retake component 3 as well, because the rule is that when they certificate, they must sit the externally assessed component. So if a learner has actually completed everything and they want to resit, then yes, they can resit, but if they resit an internally assessed component, they would have to resit the externally assessed component, which is component 3. So hopefully that's answered David's question. Jenny, just do you mind, are you able to go onto the website for the Tech Award? Because I think there was a query about the sample assessment material, and I'd just like to, if you're able to go on it.
Yes, am I still sharing?
Yeah, you're still sharing.
Great.
We're a blank
Okay.
screen. Yeah.
There we go. So I am on the Tech Awards.
Yeah.
Do you want to go on to the Tech Awards?
Just if you can just go on to the Tech Award. Okay,
Right.
so I think someone had that they could only see the AdSams, and I just wanted to, because the mark schemes are in a different place for the
Right.
AdSams as opposed to the SAM.
So I'll just show people how to navigate to the Tech Awards as it's
Yeah.
and my computer is being incredibly slow. There we go. So Tech Awards, and then we want to go to sports. There we go. S for sport. And then course materials. And then we're going to go into, here we go, sample assessment material. So the person was saying they could only see the AdSams, they couldn't see the SAMs. Is that right, or the other way around, Penny?
Yeah, I think it was that way. So just so that people understand, the SAMs, which Jenny is highlighting at the moment, there is SAMs for component 3. In that document is also the mark scheme. So you've got the question paper, and in the same document, there is the mark scheme as well. And Jenny's just going through it. So there's the question paper.
And we've got the mark scheme behind it, haven't we? There we go.
And then we've got the mark scheme behind it. Yeah, there you go. You can see the mark scheme. But if you go, so the one above that is the AdSams. Now that's a question paper, and only the question paper, which is a little bit strange. So that just has a question paper. And then if you go to the very top, you'll see the mark scheme. So there are 3 documents. The SAMS has the question paper mark scheme in the document, and the AdSams has a separate question paper document and a mark scheme.
So you'll actually see it reflects actually more closely what a real exam paper would look like. So you've got the bits at the start to make it look like a real one. So it's probably quite a good thing to look more mock-like to prepare your learners so they can have a go at filling in their centre number, learner registration number if you wanted them to do that. So they're fully prepared for the real thing. And then you've got the mark scheme that you'd use, here it is, that you'd use sort of separate to it. Sorry, that's the one here. And that would be given out after the exam, obviously, and a separate document. So whilst it does look a bit funny to have them in slightly different formats, the AdSams do reflect a bit more closely what a real life paper would look like. And Kevin, you've asked, please can you recap how to access new questions on Exam Wizard? Let's have a little look at Exam Wizard. So I'm going to go to Exam Wizard. I'm going to pop it in my search bar here. So as soon as you're on the Pearson website, you can go and use the search bar. So it's Exam Wizard. So pop it in there, and then it'll give me a little bit of chat and give me options. I want to click on the first one, and then I just go into log into Exam Wizard. So you can see that option is given to me there on the right. Click into that. Now, because I've already been onto this, I don't need to input my login. You will need a login. But first of all, you go through choosing which areas you want to look at. So I want to choose sports. I'm in the BTEC Functional Skills and T-level section. And I'm choosing sport from there. Then I'm going to proceed to log in. And that point, I'd in my login details if I hadn't already logged in earlier today. So that's got me in, and it's recognizing that I've gone in on sport. I now want to build a paper. And it's going to ask me what qualification do I want to build a paper for, so it can bring out the right level of questions. So in there, I go to level 1-2 Tech Award 2022. Okay, click on that. And then I can search. So if I've been teaching, what shall I have been teaching? I can have been teaching fitness testing. So, and then I search for that, and then it will find me questions related to fitness testing. Obviously not many, the wording perhaps wasn't particularly clever there. So I can just add that in. And then once I've chosen my question, I go to view, edit the paper, and then it will give me the questions. It's obviously remembered what I've done previously, and it will give me the questions added to that paper I've started to build. I would then save it, and I can call it questions, you know, whatever area I was focusing on, I can give it a title. So you can save a number of papers, or however many papers you want that you put together. And then if you're doing this on a regular basis, you've got yourself some set questions ready to use and replicate with your learners when you've taught different areas of the specification. Okay. Hopefully, Kevin, that's helped you out. It is sometimes when somebody's doing it, it can be very quick. So good idea to get a reminder on that. And then I'd recommend, if you get a chance, to dip in and start having a go sooner rather than later. It is quite intuitive once you've got through the initial bits. It's just a case of getting through initial bits to access that. Okay, any more questions? It's looking very quiet out there. I think you're probably all ready to go home and have your tea and settle in for a night of chilling, perhaps. So, William, there's a question. Will there be any more sample papers released before the end of the year? No, there won't. The next time you'll see a paper will be the retired live paper. So there's usually one set of sample assessment material before a live paper. We're quite lucky in our sector that we've got some AdSams, but there won't be anything further than that. But once the paper's been sat, it'll be retired, and then that will be available for you to use as mocks. So as we progress through, obviously, year in, year out, there'll be more and more papers added to the website for you to draw upon and use as mocks with your learners.
Yeah, Jenny, can I just reiterate about that terminal rule? Because I have been asked a question where learners have sat component 1 and they're due to sit component 2 and 3 in January, i.e. they've finished the course, and a centre does have a few students who want to resit component 1 again in the summer, which is fine, they can do that, but they must resit component 3 in the summer as well, regardless what they got in January. They have to sit component 3 in the summer, okay, to meet the terminal rule. So if anyone has got any queries and you want to discuss it with me, then please do set up an appointment with me, 20 minutes, and we can just go through it.
So yeah,
Thank
so
you.
essentially the external assessment has to be done last, has to be the last thing they do. So that's kind of a quick way of, right, you know, it's terminal assessment stands. That's obviously it's there for a reason, that terminology, but that's essentially what it means, isn't it? Do it last, and if you don't do it last, you have to do it again, because it still has to be the last thing you do alongside any internally assessed units. Okie dokie. Well, I think we're going to finish there. So thank you all very much for attending the session today. We hope you found it useful and informative, and there'll be further training events later on in the year. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Penny, for all your help and support. And I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you.